This lesson's on reproduction in plants and specifically pollination, fertilization, and germination. And here are the objectives. Now, flowers are the reproductive structures of angiosperms. And here we see a diagram of a cross-section of flower. This is from Science and Plants for Schools. And in addition to the stem, which supports the flower, the sepal, which protects it, and the petals, which are attractive to pollinators, we can see both the male and female parts. The carpel is the female part of the flower, and it consists of the stigma, which is a sticky top where the pollen will stick, the style, which is a supportive tube, and then the ovary, which will develop into the fruit as the flower matures after fertilization, and the ovule, which will develop into the seeds. These are together the female parts of the flower. Now, you'll also see the carpel referred to as the pistil. Those are slightly different things, but for our purposes, we won't make a distinction. So you'll see this combination of stigma, style, and ovary called either carpel or pistil. Again, that's the female part of the flower. The stamen is the male part of the flower and consists of the anther, where the pollen matures, and the filament, which supports it. And the flower is involved in the sexual reproduction of plants, which involves pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. So the first step is pollination, and pollination involves the movement of pollen, which will give rise to the sperm, from the anther, which we just saw above, to the stigma. Now, that can happen in the same plant, pollen going from the anther of its flower to the stigma of the same flower. That's called self-pollination, and some plants do that, but most cross-pollinate, which means pollinating a different plant other than yourself. That increases genetic diversity by having two parents instead of just one. And plants can use different measures to prevent self-pollination and thereafter self-fertilization. They can have separate male and female plants entirely. Some plants are just male, and some plants are just female. There can be plants that have both male and female parts but on different flowers. There can be plants that have male and female parts on the same flowers, but that mature at different times, so that the male parts and the female parts are never around at the same time for pollen to be transferred from one to the other. There can be different physical arrangements within the flower itself, so that the stigma and the anthers are never close to each other. For example, one is very tall and one is very short, so they're just not close to each other for self-pollination. And there can also be genetic methods of detecting self, so the plant can recognize whether a pollen grain comes from itself through genetics and not allow it to fertilize. So you can see that there are a number of different ways that plants try and encourage cross-pollination over self-pollination and self-fertilization. So let's talk about fertilization next. Once a pollen grain lands on the stigma, it grows a pollen tube which extends down the style towards the ovary and gives rise to two sperm cells. And both of those sperm cells travel down the pollen tube and fertilize the ovule. So if we look back to our diagram of the flower, here's a pollen grain that's landed on the stigma. It's going to grow a pollen tube that extends down the style, extending towards the ovule, and the pollen grain will give rise to two sperm cells that'll travel down here and fertilize the ovule. So we have two sperm and two fertilization events. This is very different from what we see in animals, of course. One sperm is going to fuse with the egg and give rise to the zygote that will become the embryo of the new plant, whereas the other sperm will fertilize the polar nuclei. Remember, those are produced in meiosis from the cells that don't become the egg, and the sperm and the polar nuclei together after fertilization happens becomes the endosperm, and the endosperm is a tissue that is involved in food storage. When you eat popcorn, that fluffy white part of the popcorn, what you're eating, that's the endosperm. Now, in monocots, the endosperm maintains food storage, whereas in dicots, actually the cotyledons take over that function by absorbing all of the nutrition from the endosperm. But one sperm fertilizes the egg to become the zygote, and the other sperm fertilizes the polar nuclei to become the endosperm, which is involved in food storage. Now let's take a look at the seed. So the seed contains the embryo, and it contains food stores to support the growing embryo until it can photosynthesize, and those are contained within a protective seed coat. So the seed contains the embryo and food stores in a protective seed coat. And the food stores, again, as I mentioned above, in the case of monocots, are retained in the endosperm itself, and in dicots are in the cotyledons. So if you were to split open a bean, you would see something that looks like this. This is the little embryo here. I'll make that a different color. This is the little embryo here in green. And the rest of what you are seeing, because beans are dicots, are the cotyledons. The cotyledons, again, are involved in food storage in dicots. So the seeds provide a little life support system for the embryo by giving it food that it can use until it can produce its own food by photosynthesis. Now, when conditions are right, the seed will germinate. Germination is the initial growth of a seed. And germination requires a few different things. First, it requires water. Water ruptures the seed coat and allows metabolic changes to happen. Enzymes start to digest the food stores, allowing the embryo to mobilize nutrition and grow. The next thing that's required is oxygen. Oxygen is required for cellular respiration in order to use those food stores for energy. And finally, warmth is required. Warmth is required so that chemical reactions can proceed. And again, those are being helped along by the catalytic action of enzymes. Now, light is sometimes required. Some seeds will need some light to germinate, and some seeds will actually need darkness to germinate, and some seeds don't really care either way. However, it's interesting to note that what is not required here is carbon dioxide. We often think about carbon dioxide when we think about plants because they're using carbon dioxide as a raw material for photosynthesis, but the germinating seed is not photosynthesizing yet. It's not getting its food from photosynthesis, it's getting it from the stores in the seed itself. And so it doesn't require CO2 because it's not photosynthesizing, but it does require oxygen in order to perform cellular respiration and use those food stores. So that's a quick look at reproduction in plants, including pollination, fertilization, and germination.